It was the summer of 1985, the kind of summer when the air shimmered over the desert roads and everything smelled faintly of dust and pine. The small town of Prescott Ridge sat quietly in the middle of Arizona's canyon country, a place where everyone knew each other and strangers were noticed before they even parked their cars. Officer Mark Dalton had worked in that town's police department for almost 10 years. People trusted him. He was the kind of man who stopped to help change a tire, who remembered every shopkeeper's name, who waved to the kids riding bikes near the park. He wasn't the loudest or the toughest cop, but he had a calm confidence that made people feel safe. Mark loved his job, though his wife, Linda, often worried about it. The town was small, but the land around it was wild. Long stretches of highway, abandoned mining roads, and deep canyons where cell signals didn't reach. Sometimes Mark worked the night shifts alone, patrolling those empty roads in his police cruiser, radio static crackling beside him. Their son, Ethan, was only 5 then. He loved waiting by the window when Mark's shift ended. As soon as he saw the flashing headlights of his dad's cruiser, he'd run to the door shouting, "Dad's home!" Mark would lift him up, still in uniform, and spin him around before kissing Linda goodnight. To Ethan, his father was everything a hero should be. But that summer, something changed in the air. Mark had been quieter than usual. At the dinner table, Linda noticed how he picked at his food, how his eyes looked tired even when he smiled. Sometimes she caught him sitting alone at the kitchen counter after midnight, reading reports or scribbling notes. When she asked, he only said, "Just work stuff." Nothing big. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the red hills, Mark kissed Linda goodbye and told her he'd be patrolling the old canyon road near Red Rock. It was an isolated area, rough terrain, narrow turns, no houses for miles. "Just routine checks," he said. "I'll be home before midnight." But he never came home. That night, the hours stretched long. Linda sat by the window, glancing at the clock, expecting to hear his car pull up any minute. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. She tried calling the station, and the dispatcher said he'd check in soon. But when dawn came and there was still no sign of him, Linda knew something was terribly wrong. By sunrise, the department had sent out search teams. Helicopters circled over the canyon roads. Officers combed through the dusty hills, and volunteers from town brought water and flashlights. Ethan didn't understand what was happening. He sat on the porch steps clutching his toy police car, asking every adult who passed, "Did you find my dad yet?" Late that afternoon, one of the search teams found Mark's patrol car. It was parked near a lookout point above Red Rock Canyon, engine off, driver's door open. The radio was still on, crackling faintly with static. His flashlight was on the ground, and his hat lay near the edge of the cliff. But there was no sign of Mark anywhere. The cliffside was steep, almost vertical, dropping hundreds of feet into shadows and rocks. The search teams rappelled down part of it but found nothing. No footprints leading away, no tire marks, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The official report said, "Missing in the line of duty." But in small towns, stories travel fast, and people began to whisper. Some said he had chased someone and fallen. Others thought he might have staged his disappearance. A few even hinted he had run away, though those who knew him couldn't believe it. Linda refused to accept that he had just left. She kept calling the department, pushing for more searches, more answers. For weeks she went back to that canyon overlook, staring down into the rocks and listening to the wind. Sometimes she thought she could still hear his voice calling faintly from below. Days turned into weeks and the town slowly moved on. The department eventually closed the active search, saying there was no new evidence. They held a small memorial at the station. Officers in uniform stood in silence as the chief placed Mark's photo on a table covered with flowers. Ethan didn't understand the word "missing." He kept tugging on his mother's sleeve and asking, "When's Dad coming back?" Years passed and the questions never stopped. Linda tried to build a quiet life for her and her son. She took a job at the local library and kept the house just the way Mark had left it. His jacket still hanging on the hook by the door, his old badge tucked inside the top drawer. Every now and then she would sit with a cup of coffee, looking through the yellowed newspaper clippings about his disappearance. "Still no sign of missing officer," the headline said. She never stopped hoping for a phone call, a clue, a miracle. Ethan grew up carrying that mystery like a shadow. At school, when other kids asked about his dad, he didn't know what to say. Sometimes he'd say his father was a hero. Other times, when he was angry, he'd say nothing at all. On the anniversary of his disappearance each year, he and his mother would drive out to the canyon and lay wildflowers by the fence. Linda always whispered, "We'll find you one day." But life has a way of pushing the past deeper into memory. The years rolled on and Ethan became an adult, moved to another city and built his own life. Yet somewhere inside him, a small part of that boy was still sitting on the porch waiting for his father's car to come home. Back in Prescott Ridge, the canyon never changed. The same wind blew through the same red rocks. Hikers sometimes passed the old overlook where the patrol car was found, unaware of the story behind it. The locals still mentioned it now and then, that poor officer who disappeared back in the 80s. But for most, it had faded into town legend. Only one person never stopped wondering. Linda, even as she grew older and her hair turned silver, kept every note, every map, every report connected to that night. She wrote letters to retired officers, clipped articles about similar cases, and even kept a small box labeled Mark 1985. Inside were photos, hand-drawn maps, and one piece of a torn topographic chart that Mark had been using for a patrol route before he vanished. Sometimes, when Ethan visited, he'd catch her staring at that box like she was waiting for it to speak. He'd tell her to rest, that maybe it was time to let go, but she'd smile gently and say, "You never let go of the people you love. Ethan, you just keep looking until you find the truth." By the time the 1990s came, the official story was simple. Officer Mark Dalton disappeared during a patrol, presumed dead, cause unknown. But in the corners of that small desert town, people still whispered. A retired deputy mentioned hearing something over the radio that night. A half-finished call for backup, cut short by static. Another man claimed he saw headlights speeding along the canyon road minutes before the storm rolled in. None of it was ever proven, but it kept the story alive. In 2005, 20 years after the disappearance, a construction crew found a piece of metal deep in one of the side canyons. Old, rusted, and almost unrecognizable. For a moment, rumors spread that it might be part of the missing patrol car, but investigators dismissed it as scrap from an old mining vehicle. Linda kept a clipping of that article, too. By then, Ethan was married and working as an engineer. He didn't talk much about his father anymore, but sometimes, late at night, he'd find himself searching online for any mention of the case. He'd scroll through forums, archived police bulletins, anything that might hold a new clue. The mystery had shaped him more than he liked to admit. He didn't just want closure, he wanted to know why, and then, one day life came full circle. In 2015, 30 years after the night his father vanished, Ethan returned to Prescott Ridge. His mother had passed away peacefully, leaving him the old family home. While cleaning out her attic, he found the same box he remembered from childhood, the one marked Mark 1985. Inside, everything was neatly organized just as she had left it. Among the faded papers was that same torn map, marked with a red pen near Red Rock Canyon, the same area where the patrol car was found. But there was something new that caught his attention this time, a small handwritten note tucked behind the map. It was in his father's handwriting. The note said, "If anything happens, look here." Ethan stared at it for a long time. The words felt like they were meant for him, as if his father had left behind a message waiting to be found 3 decades later. The old questions came flooding back, stronger than ever. What had his father been doing that night? What did "look here" mean? And why had no one ever searched that exact area marked on the map? That night Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by his father's papers, the same way his father once sat there late at night long ago. The house was quiet, and the desert wind whispered through the open window. Somewhere out there, at the bottom of that vast canyon, the truth had been waiting for 30 years. And for the first time since he was a little boy, Ethan decided he was ready to go and find it. When Ethan opened that old box again, dust rose into the air, drifting through the sunlight like tiny sparks. Everything inside was exactly as his mother had left it. Yellowed papers, photographs, and that single map torn across the middle. He ran his fingers over the words his father had written. "If anything happens, look here." He sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the red circle drawn on the canyon map. It was near a narrow section of Red Rock Canyon that, according to the old notes, had never been searched. He wondered why. Maybe it was too steep or too remote. Maybe no one had thought it mattered. The thought wouldn't leave him alone. That night, Ethan found himself pulling up satellite images on his laptop, comparing them with the markings on his father's map. Technology had come a long way since 1985. Now he could zoom in, trace ridges and slopes, and see trails that hadn't existed back then. He noticed something strange near the area circled in red. A faint outline of what looked like a dirt path, half hidden by rocks and brush. It led down toward a section of the canyon floor that had no records or photos online. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. It was late, and the house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. It was the same clock that had hung in the kitchen when he was a boy. It struck him then. His father might have stood in the same spot 30 years ago, holding that same map, trying to decide whether to follow that same path. The next morning, Ethan decided he couldn't ignore it anymore. He packed a small bag, filled it with water bottles, a flashlight, his phone, and the folded map. Before leaving the house, he looked once more at the framed photo of his parents on the hallway wall. His mother was smiling, and his father stood beside her in his police uniform, his hand resting proudly on her shoulder. He whispered, "I'm going to find you, Dad." The road to Red Rock Canyon hadn't changed much over the years. It was still narrow and winding, cutting through dry hills and sunburned trees. The air smelled of sage and dust. When he reached the overlook where the patrol car had been found, he parked and stepped out. The place felt frozen in time. The same rusted guardrail stood along the edge, and the same view of the canyon stretched out below. Endless layers of red and brown stone, shadows shifting with the clouds. Ethan stood there for a long time, just listening to the wind. He tried to imagine that night in 1985. His father's cruiser parked right where he stood, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the radio crackling softly. What had happened after that? He followed the markings on the map, walking along the edge of the canyon until he found the narrow path. It wasn't much of a trail, more like a faded scar in the earth half hidden by weeds. But something about it felt right, like a place someone might have taken if they didn't want to be seen. He began to climb down carefully, using the rocks for support. The deeper he went, the quieter it got. The sound of the highway faded until all he could hear was the distant rustle of wind through the canyon walls. Every few minutes he stopped to catch his breath and check the map. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, maybe an old tire, maybe nothing at all. But deep down he hoped for something more. After a couple of hours he reached a wide, flat area near the bottom. The ground was covered with old stones and desert plants. From there he looked up and realized how far he'd come. The cliffs above seemed impossibly high. For the first time he felt a strange mix of fear and calm. He was standing in a place his father might have stood, a place no one else had visited in decades. He walked slowly, scanning the ground for anything unusual. A piece of metal half buried in sand caught his eye, but when he brushed it off it turned out to be an old can. Still, the feeling of being close to something important wouldn't leave him. As the afternoon sun began to drop lower, he decided to head back before dark. He promised himself he'd return, but next time he'd come prepared. Back home, he couldn't stop thinking about the canyon. He started reading everything he could find about it: old maps, geological reports, even local legends. One article mentioned how flash floods sometimes unearthed old debris after heavy rain. That gave him an idea. He began looking into drone rentals. With the right equipment, he could explore areas that were too dangerous to reach on foot. A week later, he returned to the canyon with a drone, a camera, and a plan. He launched the drone from the same overlook and guided it carefully down into the canyon. Watching the live feed on his screen, he saw places no one could ever climb to. Narrow crevices, dry riverbeds, caves hidden behind rock formations. For a while, nothing looked unusual. But then, just as the drone drifted along a shadowed corner near the lower ridge, something metallic glimmered faintly under the sunlight. It was quick, just a flicker, but it made Ethan's heart race. He replayed the footage, zoomed in, and there it was, a shape half buried under rock and dust. Too big to be a scrap piece of junk. It looked like part of a vehicle. He saved the coordinates and stared at the screen in disbelief. Could it really be what he thought it was? Could it be the missing patrol car? He called a local guide the next morning, a man named Frank who had spent most of his life hiking and working in the canyons. Ethan didn't tell him the whole story right away. just that he wanted help exploring a remote spot. Frank agreed and offered to take ropes and climbing gear. They started early before the sun was too high. The hike was long and steep, but Frank knew the terrain well. As they descended, Ethan explained the real reason he was there. About his father, the map, the drone footage. Frank listened quietly, nodding now and then, and finally said, "You know, folks around here still talk about that cop. Some say the canyon took him. Maybe it's time someone brought him home." When they reached the spot marked on the drone's GPS, Ethan's hands were trembling. The ground was uneven, with boulders and broken trees scattered around. After a few minutes of searching, Frank called out, "Over here." Ethan rushed over. Under a layer of dirt and rock, something metallic was poking through, curved, faded blue, and clearly not part of the natural landscape. Together they began brushing away the dirt with small shovels and gloved hands. Slowly the shape started to appear, a roof, a windshield frame, and then a section of a door with a faint white stripe. Even after 30 years, the letters were still faintly visible on the door. PR Police. Ethan froze. He didn't speak. He just stared at the letters, unable to breathe. Frank stepped back quietly, giving him space. It was his father's patrol car. The vehicle was badly crushed and rusted, half buried by what must have been years of rock slides. But it was unmistakable. Ethan touched the metal gently, as if afraid it might disappear. The air around him felt heavy, not with fear, but with something deeper. The mystery that had haunted him his whole life was suddenly real, right in front of him. They didn't try to move anything that day. It was too fragile and the area was unstable. But Ethan took photos marking every detail, the license plate, the badge number on the dashboard, even the remains of the old police radio still attached inside. When they climbed back up, the sun was already setting, painting the canyon walls gold and red. Ethan looked back one last time before leaving. He knew he couldn't stop now. That night he emailed the photos and coordinates to the local sheriff's office, explaining who he was and what he had found. A day later, the department responded, saying they would send a recovery team. The next week, investigators returned to the site with proper equipment. Ethan stood near the edge as they worked. He watched as they carefully uncovered more of the car. Then one of the officers called out quietly. Inside the driver's seat, beneath layers of debris, they had found what remained of a uniform. Ethan felt tears fill his eyes, but he stayed still. The moment didn't feel real. After 30 long years, he had finally found his father. But even as relief washed over him, something else tugged at his thoughts. The car's position didn't make sense. It wasn't where it should have landed if it had simply gone off the road. And there were strange dents on the door, as if it had been hit before falling. As the team worked, one of them mentioned something odd, that there were other fragments nearby, maybe from another vehicle. Ethan listened quietly. A small chill ran through him. The mystery wasn't over yet. Finding the car had only answered one question, where his father had gone. But now there were new questions, and they were even harder to ignore. That night he sat by the canyon overlook once again, the wind cold against his face. For the first time in his life he felt close to his father, almost as if he could sense him there. But deep inside he also felt a new determination rising. He whispered into the night, "I found you, Dad, but now I need to know what really happened." And as the stars appeared above the desert, Ethan knew his search was far from over. The truth had been buried deep for 30 years, and he was just beginning to uncover it. The day after the recovery team found the patrol car, the small town of Prescott Ridge felt different. For years, people had talked about Officer Mark Dalton's disappearance like it was a ghost story, but now it was real again. The local news covered the story with quiet respect, showing photos of the canyon and the rusted remains of the car. Ethan didn't want attention. He stayed out of the interviews and kept to himself. Finding his father's patrol car had brought both peace and confusion. Peace because the mystery of his father's disappearance was finally coming to an end. Confusion because the evidence didn't fit the story everyone had believed for decades. The sheriff's office called him in to go over the findings. The officers were kind but cautious. They confirmed that the uniform found inside the car belonged to his father. Personal items, a badge, a pocket notebook, and his wristwatch, were also recovered. Ethan took the watch home. It was rusted and cracked, but he placed it on his desk beside the old map. He stared at it for a long time that night. It felt like the past had finally reached out and touched the present. Yet something inside him whispered that the story wasn't over. A few days later, one of the investigators called to say that a second set of remains had been found nearby, only a few meters away from the car, partly hidden by rocks. They hadn't been noticed during the first search. The news hit Ethan hard. Who could it be? When the lab results came back, the second set of remains was identified as belonging to Deputy Carl Jenkins, a name Ethan didn't recognize at first. But when he checked through his father's old papers, the name appeared several times, written in neat handwriting in the margins of reports. Jenkins had worked in the same department back in 1985. Ethan's curiosity deepened. He visited the local library to dig through old archives. The librarian, an elderly man who had known his father, helped him find newspaper clippings and public records. One article stood out. It mentioned that Deputy Jenkins had resigned just a few days after Mark disappeared. No one had heard from him again after that. Ethan sat in the quiet library reading and rereading the line. His father and Jenkins were on duty around the same time. His father vanished. Jenkins quit, and now, 30 years later, both were found in the same canyon. That couldn't be a coincidence. The sheriff's office wasn't ready to make conclusions. They told Ethan that the investigation would take time, but patience wasn't easy for him. For most of his life, he had lived with questions, and now he was finally getting close to the truth. He wanted to understand everything: what happened that night, why his father was there, and what his last moments were like. He decided to go back through his father's belongings again. In the box from the attic, he found a small notebook that had been overlooked before. The pages were faded and stained, but still readable. Most of it contained ordinary patrol notes, license plates, road conditions, small incidents. But near the back, a few pages were different. The handwriting grew tighter, more rushed. One line caught Ethan's attention. Meeting CJ about warehouse trucks. Doesn't add up. CJ. It had to be Carl Jenkins. The next page had another note. Need to bring this up soon. Not everyone at the station can be trusted. Ethan's stomach turned. What did his father mean by that? Was he investigating something that put him in danger? He copied the notes and drove to the sheriff's office to show them. The new sheriff, a woman named Grace Holloway, took the papers seriously. She wasn't from the old days, and she had joined long after 1985, but she knew the history of the case. She told Ethan that if his father had been looking into something involving department corruption or illegal activity, the truth might have been hidden all these years. She promised to reopen the case officially. Over the next few weeks, investigators combed through old files. Many had been lost or misplaced, but a few records still existed. They found mention of an operation in 1985 involving stolen goods being moved through the region, electronics, car parts, and other valuable items. Some reports suggested that the smugglers might have had help from someone inside law enforcement. Ethan listened to all this with a heavy heart. If his father had discovered something like that, it could explain everything. Maybe he confronted someone that night. Maybe he was silenced, but there was still no proof, only pieces of a puzzle. One evening, unable to sleep, Ethan decided to return to the canyon once more. He parked his truck near the overlook and sat on the hood, watching the sky fade from gold to purple. The desert air cooled as night crept in. He could hear crickets and the faint whisper of wind brushing through the canyon walls. He thought about how long his father had been down there, alone and forgotten. 30 years, a whole lifetime. He walked to the spot where the guardrail ended. His flashlight beam moved across the rocks. That's when he noticed something glinting just a few steps beyond the fence. He crouched down and brushed away the dirt. It was a small metal badge, old and tarnished but still legible. It wasn't his father's, it belonged to another department, one from a neighboring county. He turned it over in his hand, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. The next morning, he took it straight to Sheriff Holloway. She looked at it carefully and confirmed that the badge number belonged to an officer from a nearby town who had been dismissed in the mid-'80s for misconduct. The officer's name wasn't familiar, but records showed he had once worked closely with Jenkins. The story was beginning to unfold, layer by layer. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that back in 1985, Jenkins and that officer had been working undercover on a supposed sting operation related to stolen goods. But the paperwork was vague. There were no official orders, no sign-offs from higher-ups. It looked like something off the books. The theory forming now was that Mark Dalton had stumbled onto something he wasn't meant to find. Maybe he found out that his fellow officers were involved in something illegal. Maybe he confronted them, and things got out of control. Ethan didn't know what hurt more, the idea that his father was betrayed or that people he trusted might have hidden it all these years. He spent hours reading through every report, every interview transcript. Sheriff Holloway shared updates with him regularly, but she warned him that some of the key witnesses were either deceased or too old to remember clearly. Still, small details kept surfacing, things that matched his father's notes, places mentioned in Jenkins's old records, even a few receipts from fuel stations near the canyon dated that same week. One evening, while going through those papers, Ethan found something that made him pause. It was a photocopy of an old dispatch log. On the night his father disappeared, there had been a radio call at 10:47 p.m., just a few minutes before his car was found abandoned. The log recorded a broken message. Unit 12, need assist, read, and then silence. The call had never been followed up. Ethan's eyes filled with tears as he read it. His father had tried to call for help. He shared the log with the sheriff, who confirmed that Unit 12 was his father's call sign. It was another piece of proof that something serious happened that night. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation began to gain attention beyond Prescott Ridge. Reporters from nearby cities came to cover the story. For Ethan, it wasn't about publicity, it was about closure. One afternoon, while sorting through the recovered items from the canyon, an investigator found a small metal key wrapped in cloth. It was inside a pocket of his father's uniform. No one knew what it opened, but etched on it were the numbers 34. Ethan's heart raced when he heard about it. He went back to the notes in his father's notebook. One page had a simple line, "Locker 34, keep separate." With the sheriff's help, they traced it to an old storage facility the department had once used. The building was long abandoned, but the lockers were still there. When they opened Locker 34, a layer of dust spilled out, and inside was a weathered cardboard box marked Evidence Warehouse Route. Inside the box were photos, license plate numbers, and handwritten notes. The photos showed trucks parked near a warehouse at the edge of town, the same warehouse mentioned in his father's notes. Some of the vehicles had markings belonging to the local department, suggesting that police vehicles were being used to escort stolen shipments. It was the final piece. Ethan stood there staring at the evidence, his hands shaking. His father hadn't vanished because of bad luck or a random accident. He had discovered something corrupt, something powerful, and paid the price for it. The sheriff promised that the case would be sent to state authorities for review. Even though decades had passed, the truth was finally out. The story spread quickly, and people in Prescott Ridge began to see Mark Dalton not as the officer who disappeared, but as the man who tried to do the right thing. That evening, Ethan drove back to the canyon one more time. The sun was setting again, painting the rocks in orange light. He stood at the overlook and looked down where the car had been found. He held his father's old badge in one hand and whispered, "You didn't disappear, Dad. They just tried to bury the truth. But I found it. I found you." The wind blew softly through the canyon, carrying his words into the distance. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt something close to peace. But he also knew that one last part of the story still needed to be told, how it all happened, and who had made sure the truth stayed buried for 30 long years, and he was ready to find out. After the discovery of Locker 34, everything in Prescott Ridge began to shift. What had been a small-town mystery for decades was now becoming something far bigger. The evidence inside the box told a story that no one had been willing to believe before. A story about trust, betrayal, and a man who had paid for being honest. For weeks, investigators from the state were in and out of town. They went through every piece of paper, every photograph, every item connected to the old case. The warehouse that appeared in the photos was long abandoned, but it still stood on the outskirts of town, its roof caved in and windows boarded up. Ethan went there with the sheriff's team one morning to see it for himself. Standing in front of the building felt strange. It was silent except for the wind whistling through cracks in the metal walls. Weeds had grown tall around the fences and faded tire tracks still marked the ground. Ethan imagined his father standing there 30 years earlier, taking those same photos, probably realizing that something illegal was happening right under his nose. The sheriff's team searched the site and found more signs that supported his father's notes. Pieces of broken crates, rusted tags with company names, and old police tape hidden under debris. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove that the warehouse had once been used for something that wasn't in the official records. When they returned to the station, one of the older officers stopped Ethan in the hallway. His name was Tom Harris, and he had been a rookie in 1985, one of the youngest members of the department back then. His hair was gray now, and his voice carried the weight of years. He said quietly, "I remember your father. He was the straightest man I ever knew." There were whispers back then, things I didn't want to believe. I wish I'd asked more questions. Ethan could see guilt in his eyes. "What kind of whispers?" he asked. Tom looked around before answering. There were rumors that a few officers were helping move stolen shipments through town. Your dad was getting close to figuring it out. Then one night he went missing and everything stopped. People stopped talking. It was like the whole thing was swept under the rug. Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't need to hear more to understand. The silence after his father's disappearance wasn't an accident. It had been convenient for some people. As days passed, more details came to light. The state investigation uncovered old bank records showing unexplained deposits in the accounts of 2 retired officers who had worked closely with Jenkins. When questioned, they claimed it was overtime pay, but the records told a different story. It became clear that Mark Dalton had discovered a smuggling route that used official police vehicles to move stolen goods between counties. He had gathered enough evidence to expose it, but before he could report it, he vanished. When Ethan learned this, it felt like both a wound and a relief. He finally knew why his father never came home. But knowing also meant facing the truth that for 30 years the story had been buried to protect others. The sheriff told him the investigation would now move to a grand jury review. That meant the truth would finally be public. Ethan sat quietly in her office after hearing the news. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said softly, "He wasn't just a missing officer. He was trying to do the right thing." Sheriff Holloway nodded. "And now everyone will know it." That night, Ethan drove out to the canyon again. It had become his place of reflection. The desert sky stretched wide above him, full of stars. He walked to the edge of the overlook where it all began. Down below, somewhere in the darkness, was the place where his father's car had rested for 30 years. He sat on a rock and looked out into the distance. "I found it, Dad," he whispered. They can't hide it anymore. For the first time, he didn't feel lost. He felt connected, not just to his father, but to the truth that his father had died protecting. In the following weeks, news stations began covering the story again. People who had long forgotten the name Mark Dalton started talking about him with respect. Old friends called Ethan to share memories. Small things like how his father once helped fix a neighbor's roof or gave food to a family after a storm. Those stories made Ethan smile. They reminded him that even before all this, his father had been a good man in the simplest ways. But one morning, just when it seemed everything had been uncovered, Sheriff Holloway called him again. She said there was something else he needed to see. At the station, she handed him a file that had been sent over by the state team. Inside was a copy of a handwritten report dated 2 days before the disappearance. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was familiar. His father's. The report detailed an incident involving a meeting with Jenkins and another officer. It mentioned evidence of misuse of patrol vehicles and a plan to meet at Red Rock Canyon to discuss what to do next. Ethan felt a shiver. That meant his father had gone to that canyon willingly that night, probably thinking he was meeting someone he could trust. He wasn't ambushed or lost. He was following duty. The last line of the report read, "If Jenkins can confirm, this will break everything open." Ethan set the paper down slowly. He understood now that Jenkins hadn't been his father's enemy. Maybe he had gone with him that night. Maybe something went wrong, but they had both paid the price. The second set of remains made sense now. 2 men trying to do the right thing, caught in something bigger than either of them could control. The town reacted with quiet sadness when the final report was released. The investigation confirmed that Mark Dalton and Carl Jenkins had both died the same night, their deaths connected to an effort to uncover internal corruption in the department. The report didn't name everyone involved, but it was enough to clear their names. A memorial was planned at the police station. Officers, both old and new, gathered to honor the two men who had been forgotten for too long. Ethan stood near the front, holding his father's old badge in his hand. The sheriff gave a short speech about integrity and courage, about how sometimes the truth takes time to rise to the surface. When she mentioned his father's name, everyone stood and clapped. Ethan looked up, fighting back tears. For the first time, his father's story was being told the way it deserved to be. After the ceremony, Tom Harris came up to him again. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. Ethan smiled faintly. "I just did what he would have done, kept looking until I found the truth." Tom nodded. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do." That evening, Ethan went home and opened his father's notebook one last time. He read through every page until he reached the end. There were no more clues, no more mysteries, just a final note written in faded ink. "Always do what's right, even when no one's watching." Those words stayed with him. In the days that followed, Ethan helped the town plan a small memorial site near the canyon overlook. It wasn't fancy, just a stone marker with both men's names and the words, "They never stopped searching for the truth." On the day it was placed, people gathered quietly as the sun began to set. The light painted the canyon in soft gold, and a gentle breeze blew through the desert grass. Ethan placed his father's old wristwatch on the base of the stone and stepped back. For a moment, he thought about the little boy who used to wait by the window, watching for his father's headlights to appear in the driveway. That boy had waited his whole life for this moment, to finally bring his father home. He whispered softly, "You can rest now, Dad." As the crowd began to leave, Ethan stayed behind for a while. The canyon below was calm and still, no longer a place of mystery but of peace. He realized that the story wasn't just about loss. It was about courage, and how truth finds a way to rise no matter how long it takes. He smiled as he looked toward the horizon. The sun dipped low and the first stars began to shine. Somewhere out there he felt sure his father was proud. When he finally turned to leave, he took one last look at the canyon, the place that had held so many secrets for so long, and whispered, "Thank you for leading me here." As he walked back to his car, the desert air felt lighter, warmer. The truth had been buried for 30 years, but now it was free. Ethan drove home in silence, the road winding under the fading sky. He knew this part of the story was over, but something inside him told him there was still more to uncover. Not about his father, but about himself. The search for truth had changed him. It had taught him that sometimes, even the quietest voices can echo for decades if someone's willing to listen. And that night, as he placed his father's notebook and badge on the table beside him, he whispered one last promise to the memory that had guided his whole life. "I'll keep your story alive." The months that followed the reopening of the case were unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing the past anymore. The past was finally catching up to him. Reporters came and went. People he didn't even know wrote letters thanking him for never giving up on the truth. And every now and then, he still received old photographs in the mail. Pictures of his father taken by neighbors, co-workers, or family friends who had held on to them for years. Each one told a small part of the story. His father smiling at a summer fair, shaking hands with a shop owner holding a fishing rod with a little boy on his lap. Every image filled in a piece of what Ethan had lost. The town began to change too. The police station, which had once been quiet about the case, now displayed a framed tribute near the entrance. Inside it were the two badges, Mark Dalton's and Carl Jenkins, with the words engraved below, "For those who stood for what was right." Ethan visited often. He would stand there quietly, just looking at it. Some days, officers would come up to him and share stories he had never heard before. One said his father once helped him when his car broke down on patrol. Another said Mark had taught him how to stay calm in tense situations. Everyone spoke with respect, almost as if they were trying to make up for the years when his father's name had been forgotten. But even with all the recognition, Ethan still felt a strange emptiness inside. The truth had been revealed, yes. The lies had been uncovered. But what do you do after finding something you've spent your whole life searching for? He found himself going back to the canyon more often, not because he needed answers anymore, but because it had become part of him, the place where his father's voice seemed to echo in the wind. He would sit on the same rock overlooking the valley, watch the light change, and think about how much one person's courage can affect the lives of others. One afternoon, he brought a small wooden box with him. Inside it was the old wristwatch his father had worn every day, the same one that had been found in the car. He had cleaned it and replaced the cracked glass. It didn't tick anymore, but he couldn't throw it away. He placed the box on the stone marker by the memorial and whispered softly, "You can rest here now. You've done enough." He stayed there for a long time, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The canyon glowed orange and gold, and a soft wind carried the faint scent of rain from the desert. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels full, not empty. In the following weeks, Ethan started working with a small group of volunteers to create a community archive, a place where people could share old stories, photos and records about the town's history. He wanted to make sure no one else's story would ever be lost the way his father's had been. He spent his evenings scanning old newspaper clippings and sorting through boxes of documents that people dropped off. Sometimes he'd find articles written about his father's case back in 1985, full of speculation and unanswered questions. It hurt to read them, but he kept them all. He wanted the record to be complete, even with the ugly parts. One night, while he was organizing the files, he found a letter tucked inside an old folder. It was addressed to Linda and Ethan Dalton. The handwriting was faded but familiar, his father's. The letter must have been written days before his disappearance and never sent. His hands shook as he opened it. It read, "If you're reading this, it means I've gone farther into something than I meant to. I can't explain everything, but I want you both to know that everything I'm doing for the right reasons. There are things happening that need to stop, and if it costs me, then that's how it will be. Don't ever doubt that I love you both. Be brave, be honest, and always keep faith that truth will find its way home." Ethan sat there in silence after finishing it. Tears welled in his eyes, but they weren't the kind of tears that came from sadness. They were full of pride, love, and peace. It felt like his father had finally spoken to him, after all the years of silence. The next morning he visited the canyon again and read the letter aloud at the memorial. A few townspeople were there too, the sheriff, Tom Harris, and some of his father's old friends. When he finished reading, no one said a word. They just stood quietly, letting the weight of those words sink in. Later, Sheriff Holloway placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "He'd be proud of you, you know." Ethan nodded. "I think he already is." Time moved on. Seasons changed. The town grew busier, but the canyon remained the same, quiet, steady, timeless. The memorial became a small stop for travelers and locals alike. People left flowers, notes, and sometimes small badges with messages carved into them. "Thank you for doing what's right." Ethan stayed involved with the community archive, turning it into a small museum over time. There, visitors could read about local heroes, see old photographs, and even listen to recorded interviews from people who had lived through the events of the 1980s. He wanted it to be a place that reminded people of the power of truth, how one person's courage can echo for generations. Sometimes, on quiet days, school children would visit, and teachers would tell them about Officer Dalton, not as a man who disappeared, but as a man who stood for honesty. Watching the children listen with wide eyes made Ethan smile. His father's story wasn't just a headline anymore. It had become a lesson. Years passed, and life slowly returned to something peaceful. Ethan got married, built a family, and often brought them to the canyon. His children knew the story by heart. The story of their grandfather who followed his duty even when it led him down a dangerous road. On one clear evening, as the sun was setting behind the red cliffs, Ethan and his family sat by the overlook. His daughter, who was around the same age he had been when his father vanished, asked softly, "Dad, do you think Grandpa knows we're here?" Ethan smiled. "I think he's been here all along." She nodded thoughtfully, staring out at the sky. "I like that." He looked around at his family, the laughter, the warmth, the love, and realized something. The story that began with loss had ended with life. The truth that had once been buried had grown into something strong enough to touch others, even decades later. When they left that evening, Ethan looked back one last time. The memorial stone glowed in the fading light. It no longer looked lonely. It looked complete. That night, as he sat by his desk, Ethan opened his father's notebook again. The pages were worn and soft now, the ink faded in places, but one thing still stood out. The words written on the very last page. The truth is never lost. It waits to be found. He closed the notebook gently and looked out the window. The stars outside shone like tiny fires across the sky. The same stars his father had seen all those years ago on his last night. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt no weight on his chest, no questions left unanswered. His search was over. He whispered softly into the quiet room, "Thank you, Dad. You can rest now. We're okay." And as he turned off the light, a soft peace filled the air, the kind that comes only when truth finally finds its way home.